In weather. In London, it's 11 degrees Celsius with clear skies and sun. Today, you can expect mostly sunny weather, with a high of 13 degrees and a low of 8 degrees. From BBC World Service.
Hello, I'm Debbie Russ with the BBC News. Japan's governing Liberal Democratic Party has elected a new leader, Fumio Kishida, who's almost certain to become the country's prime minister within days. Mr. Kishida is a former foreign minister who's considered to be a consensus builder. During his leadership campaign, he made much of public discontent over how the coronavirus pandemic had been handled. In his acceptance speech, Mr. Kishida promised to tackle the many issues facing the country, including COVID-19, a declining birth rate, and regional tensions. Marika Oi reports.
It wasn't the most popular candidate among Japanese voters who won the ruling party's leadership election. Taro Kono, who has 2.5 million Twitter followers, lost. And instead, former Foreign Minister Fumio Kishida was elected, becoming the country's 100th Prime Minister when Parliament holds an extraordinary session on the 4th of October. His first mission is to bring a victory to the ruling party in a general election that must be held by the end of next month. Its popularity has suffered after the government pushed ahead to host the Tokyo Olympics despite strong public opposition. Voters will also be watching how he can help the world's third biggest economy recover from COVID restrictions.
A new study has revealed the extent of foreign project funding by China, much of it in the form of expensive loans concealed from government balance sheets. The researchers in the US say that China frequently demands collateral from borrowing countries through profits derived from their natural resources. Brad Parks from the University of William and Mary led the study.
Major Western powers and multilateral institutions have really focused on making sure that public finances in poor countries are strong, and that means providing grants and low-interest loans. A typical overseas loan from China has a 4% interest rate, and a typical loan from Germany or France or Japan has a 1% interest rate. So China's on the hunt for profitable revenue-generating projects.
South Korea's military says North Korea's new hypersonic missile, test-fired on Tuesday, is at an early stage of development and can be detected and intercepted. Hypersonic missiles travel at 5 times the speed of sound. A North Korean state media photo showed a missile mounted with a finned, cone-shaped payload soaring into the air amid bright orange flames. Laura Bicker is our Seoul correspondent.
There are 2 things that analysts here are looking at. First of all, they've developed a hypersonic missile. This is the kind of missile that we're already seeing the likes of the United States, the Chinese and the Russians trying to develop. The reason people want to develop these hypersonic missiles is, first of all, the speed that they can fly at, and of course they can maneuver really easily because they fly at low level. They also say it's a strategic missile. That's North Korean speak for it can take a nuclear warhead.
You're listening to the World News from the BBC. A trial is starting in Britain to test a theory that vitamin A might be able to treat the loss or altered sense of smell in people who've had COVID-19. Volunteers will be given nasal drops over 12 weeks, some containing the vitamin, and then asked to sniff powerful odours such as rotten eggs and roses. The British government says it plans to relax the regulation of gene-edited crops to enable them to be commercially grown in England. New legislation will be introduced to allow them to be tested and assessed. The changes are possible because Britain, having left the European Union, no longer has to follow strict EU regulations. Palab Ghosh explains.
Gene-edited crops have much simpler changes to their DNA than so-called genetically modified ones. But the EU requires that they're both regulated in the same way. The rules call for a number of field trials over a period of several years, as well as extensive food safety tests. The regulations are regarded as too onerous and expensive by biotech firms, and so no genetically altered products are commercially developed in the European Union.
Fresh tensions have surfaced between Britain and France over post-Brexit fishing rights. The French government has accused the UK of holding its fishing industry hostage after dozens of applications for small boats to fish in Britain waters were refused. Britain said there wasn't enough evidence that those vessels had fished there in the past. One of the most successful boxers of all time, Manny Pacquiao of the Philippines, has announced he's retiring from the sport to focus on his bid to win next year's presidential election. He's already a senator. Pacquiao, who's 42, has promised to fight poverty and corruption in the Philippines if he wins the election next May to replace the country's controversial president, Rodrigo Duterte. And that's the latest world news from the BBC.
From BBC News.
Hello, I'm Karin Giannoni. This is BBC World News, the headlines. A new study has revealed the extent of foreign project funding by China, much of it in the form of expensive loans concealed from government balance sheets. A lot of the money supports China's Belt and Road initiative. Japan's governing Liberal Democratic Party has elected Fumio Kishida as its new leader. He'll become Japan's prime minister within days. Mr. Kishida is a former foreign minister who's considered to be a consensus builder. North Korea says it's fired a new type of hypersonic missile off its east coast. Hypersonic missiles travel at 5 times the speed of sound. Its warhead is said to be more difficult for defence systems to intercept. The premiere of the latest James Bond film, No Time to Die, has finally taken place in London after an 18-month delay. Its release was delayed a number of times because of the pandemic.
From Sky News.
Good afternoon, all that's to come, but first, the Transport Secretary has insisted the government is seeing the first signs of stabilisation in the UK's fuel supply. This comes as the Army has been put on standby to help deal with the crisis, which has seen petrol stations run dry across the country. It was all sparked by a shortage of fuel lorry drivers and made worse by days of panic buying by motorists. Let's get an update on the current situation. Our correspondent Charlotte Lomas is here and been looking at things up and down the country and the various parties involved, their latest responses. What can you tell us, Charlotte?
Well, the situation is improving, but we're still seeing queues across the country and some petrol stations remain closed. The Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps, says the situation is beginning to stabilise. And he says the Army are familiarising themselves with fuel distribution in the event they're needed to step in.
Well, we've certainly brought in a lot of different measures. The Army coming in to familiarise themselves with the distribution is the 18th separate measure we've taken. And of course, a lot of petrol's now being transferred into people's cars. And there are now the first very tentative signs of stabilisation in the forecourt storage, which won't be reflected in the queues as yet. But it's the first time we've seen more petrol in the petrol stations itself. I think, as the industry said yesterday, the sooner we can all return to our normal buying habits, the sooner the situation will return to normal.
Let's take a look now at some of the latest figures that we have for you. BP has said as of last night about a third of its stations, that's around 400, were out of fuel. And the Environment Secretary, George Eustace, told Sky News that as of yesterday, demand was 20% higher than average. That's down from about 50% higher on Saturday. And in the last hour, the Petrol Retailers Association said there is still a problem.
The extreme demand levels witnessed over the weekend have eased somewhat. There are still demand levels well above the norm. As a result, many of our members have sites dry, and many of the big groups are down to about 50% of their sites being dry. So there is still a problem out there. There is still a bit of panic buying. There's still queuing. But we are hopeful that we are seeing the first signs of a move towards equilibrium later in the week.
Well, we can show you now some of those queues here at petrol stations around the country. This one here was a scene at one forecourt in Bedford this afternoon. But we have seen tankers leaving the Kingsbury oil terminal in Tamworth in the West Midlands. So petrol is on its way to some of the forecourts. Meanwhile, the government's confirmed that the military has been put on standby to help with the supply shortage if needed. Up to 150 military tanker drivers are being trained to deliver to forecourts in case they need to be deployed. So how is this crisis impacting critical frontline workers? Well, there are growing calls from unions and professional bodies for key workers to be allowed priority access to fuel supplies. The teaching union, the NASUWT, says its members should be included to minimise disruption to schools. And the British Medical Association told Sky News a little earlier that essential services could be hit if staff are unable to work.
Like many others, if I need fuel, then I can't be waiting 2 or 3 hours because I've got patients who are very unwell to see, and many other colleagues who work in the community will feel the same way. And as I said, we've had no information at all. Nothing has been told to us by the senior managers, by the politicians, to the health and social care workers, and that's just not right. We want to get on with our job. But we can't do that if we haven't got the transport to do it. And as I say, so much work goes on in the community to help our patients that we need action immediately. We need urgent action today from the government. Now they designate a local fuel station for priority critical workers. That's one solution, but we've heard nothing at all. And I hope the government act today on this.
In the meantime, a number of local councils are looking to take matters into their own hands to allow key workers priority access to the pumps. Surrey Council saying that social workers may be given a card which enables them to access those supplies. So what are the fuel companies telling us? 10 companies, including BP and Shell, have said in a statement that as many cars are now holding more fuel than usual, we expect that demand will return to its normal levels in the coming days. That's easing pressures on fuel station forecourts. We've also been hearing from the RAC, who say since Friday, we've seen a sharp increase in the number of our members who've been broken down as a result of running out of fuel. On Monday alone, we attended twice as many drivers in a single day for this problem than we would normally see over a whole week.
Thank you, Charlotte. Let's speak to Sky's Lisa Dowd. She's in the West Midlands today, where tempers have been fraying in lengthy queues there.
Frustration and anger, actually. Frustration directed against the man who runs this petrol station behind me, but also against other motorists as well. A lot of talk about panic buying, but when you ask people why they are getting fuel, they all appear to have a valid reason. Now, this morning there were queues at this petrol station. People were being limited to £35 of fuel per person. They have since run out, but they are hoping for a delivery later on today. One man I heard of had travelled 20 miles or so to come here and fill up. I spoke to Andrew Kilpatrick, who travelled 10 miles or so. He said all of the petrol stations around him were running dry, so he had travelled here and spent £15. He'd limited himself to that, and this is what he told me.
Because of the situation, I'm lucky to have a hybrid car, so I can get by with the charge, but I only get so many miles out of that. I thought I'd put some fuel in just as a backup. And I'm putting the bare minimum in because ultimately I don't want to take it away from services that need it, like ambulances, taxi drivers, people that rely on their vehicles in order to survive and make a living.
Irritation and upset here, but elsewhere tensions really have flared in an isolated incident in southeast London, which we can show you footage of at Welling, where we see a man has been challenging another motorist. He appears to be holding a knife within the fuel queue. Now, we know from the Metropolitan Police that they came out to this incident. They found neither motorist, but they are now reviewing this footage of this incident, which happened yesterday afternoon. Back here, people are still turning up for fuel, still being turned around, and still frustrated that they can't get the petrol or diesel that they say they need.
Lisa Dowd reporting there from the West Midlands. So just how damaging is this crisis for the government? We can head to Westminster, where our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates, has been keeping across things. And the Transport Secretary sounding optimistic today, Sam. But this is part of a bigger problem, isn't it?
That's right. How damaging is it? Well, we're just going to have to wait and see how the next few days go, because the government has been arguing that essentially the fuel scare, the crisis, was caused by the leak of information last week that some forecourts were running a little bit low on fuel, on petrol, and that meant everyone rushed to the forecourts to fill up their cars, and that as time progresses, as the situation eases, that panic buying is going to go away. And there is some data, as you say, that things are not as bad as they were at the weekend. And also you just have the fact that people will have filled up and won't need to do so again, a fact that that ministers are pointing to. But the problem that the government has is that there are longer term issues that are also contributing to this. The reason that there was a shortage in the first place was because of the lack of lorry drivers. Yes, the government has taken steps. Grant Shapps points out that there are 18 steps. The last one that they took last night was to announce that they were putting army drivers on standby. But they don't want to use those, because anything that they do like that, or start to limit who can use petrol stations just to key workers, will signal that there is a big problem still, and people will continue to panic buy, and that will drain the reserves once again. So the government is really walking a careful tightrope, not wanting to sound too alarmist, making sure that they reflect all of the more positive news, and hope that essentially the public calming down is the best way to deal with this, with all eyes on Boris Johnson to see whether he sends out a message to the country to calm down.
In BBC Radio 4 from TuneIn.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello, welcome to Best of Today. I'm Nick Robinson, presenting the programme this week from the Labour Party conference in Brighton. Now, if you want to have your name cheered to the rafters here, particularly on the conference fringe, it looks as if all you have to do is quit your job, denounce your leader, accuse him of dividing the Labour Party and failing to honour the promises he made to get the job in the first place. That's what Andy McDonald did yesterday. The man who was Shadow Secretary for Employment Rights and Protections resigned when he was told the party leadership would not commit to a policy of increasing the minimum wage to £15 an hour. Last night, a rally of Jeremy Corbyn's supporters at what's called the Tribune Rally hailed him as a hero.
So I want to welcome to the stage the man who resigned today from the Shadow Cabinet, a fighter for workers, Andy McDonald.
Comrades, what an incredible welcome, and it's been a torrid day. It's been a really difficult thing for me to do. Well, it's pretty simple. We've made this commitment over years and years. It was back in 2014 we were talking about £10 an hour. Here we are in this situation, and the very working people who've got us through this pandemic, and the only thing that we can offer them is £10 at least. It's just not good enough. I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for the support that you've shown me tonight. This has been absolutely beautiful to be here. Thank you.
Our first speaker of the final two is John McDonnell.
Angry at what's happened. Instead of preparing the vision, debating the policies, no, what we're going to do is we're going to spend our time talking about the Labour Party rule book. What leader wants to debate in his first real physical conference the way you select your successor? What leader do you know that actually starts designing the method for his own assassination?
Andy, 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 they chanted at the end of that event. One of his friends, one of his allies in the struggle by supporters of the former Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn is Diane Abbott, the former Shadow Home Secretary, the Labour MP for Hackney North and Stoke Newington. I spoke to her this morning.
What I argue is there's no point clapping low-paid NHS or social care workers. You can't live on claps. And yes, I think you'll find a lot of constituency delegates support £15 an hour. It's the very least.
Some of Keir Starmer's close aides claim this is a deliberate plotted sabotage. Mr McDonnell's resignation came just days after he'd actually approved a package including this lower figure for the minimum wage. And hey presto, there's all sorts of photo tweets come out the second he resigns. This is a campaign to sabotage Keir Starmer's conference.
Here is your sports update. In football, last Sunday the 26th of September in La Liga, Barcelona beat Levante 3-0. Barcelona will face off against Benfica tonight at 8 p.m. in the UEFA Champions League. FC Bayern will face off against Dynamo Kiev tonight at 8 p.m. in the UEFA Champions League. Chelsea will play Juventus tonight at 8 p.m. in the UEFA Champions League. Manchester United will face off against Villarreal tonight at 8 p.m. in the UEFA Champions League. Last Sunday the 26th of September in the English Premier League, Arsenal beat Tottenham 3-1.